because a potential new threat was on the horizon, and the townsfolk were incredibly frightened. Several elderly women had been attacked throughout the city, raped, harmed, and more recently, the attacks had grown violent. A woman by the name of Narnie Box Brayson, who was a retiree at the age of 77 and had lived alone, had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death with a telephone cord on July 8th in 1981. We do get into things quite quickly in this story. And Amarillo, the city, was in a really strange time frame for their history. Chief Neal of the Amarillo Police Department was new to the city, but just before his arrival, the department had suffered from some intense criticism after a string of screwed up capital murder investigations. There were newspaper articles that went around saying police force had poor training, public lost a lot of was where the window was broken and the killer's point of entry, and they'd collected evidence including a butter knife under her bed, taken her bed linens, found fingerprints that were actually lifted from the blade of the knife, as well as the nun's headboard. An additional kitchen knife found in the driveway outside was collected, as well as chunks of afro-textured black hair and semen as well. It was clear to the officers that she was attacked as she had slept and was brutally raped, beaten, strangled, and mutilated in the exact manner as the elderly victim before her in town, Bryson. Now, the killer had gained access to the convent by going through a cut screen, breaking the glass through the back, and climbed through the window. He had then quietly entered and went down the halls, up the stairwell, down the hallway, past other nuns whom were sleeping, and made his way into Sister Benz's room. And actually, Mrs. Bryson, who had died earlier, only lived a few short blocks away from the St. Francis convent, so the killer was being very particular. The autopsy had revealed stab wounds, contusions to the head, and abrasive neck injuries, but pathologists had ruled that the cause of death was due to strangulation, with additional signs of external bleeding and internal trauma, which indicated rape. Now, it was very evident on everyone's minds that the Bryson and Benz murders were connected, and most likely connected to the other attacks of elderly women in the city as well. The victims were very similar in age. They both had similar attacks, but also, both of these cases, the killer had left a crumpled up white t-shirt next to their bodies that was believed to be the murderers. At the time, police officials were concerned that maybe this was some sort of satanic cult, harming a nun on Halloween. seek out the death penalty swiftly to help with that. So he was very intense. Now, the district attorney, Amarillo, is heavily in the Bible Belts, and he knew that if he called anyone to trial, if they had enough evidence, the God-fearing people of the city would stand behind him and, to help solve the cases, right? Seems a bit Salem witch trial-y to me, which is, go watch that video if you haven't. But it was a bit, and it did get a bit manhunty, but he had good intentions originally. So at this point, you have a big mob mentality going on, finding out who it is, getting things done, bringing justice to the Bible Belt again. And people thought that this this is related to that. Oh no, naive. And her sister had actually phoned her to say, no, Charlotte, it's not the neighbors that think it, it's the police. So she loaded up her 3 other children, a big family, and drove to the police station where there was lights, cameras, it was a zoo. And despite what they were saying, his mother knew that said and done, and there was no sense in trying, and that they should just give up. Like, excuse me, don't represent my son then. Go away. But because everyone said that he had already confessed, it was honestly just a very bad time for Johnny and Charlotte and the family, especially because they had no money to get a new attorney or do anything, and they also didn't know their rights very well. On Johnny's first court appearance, media coverage was everywhere, and Johnny was very confident as he spoke to the Judge George Don, stating that he was an innocent man to the police, and the allegations against him were a blatant lie. He explained that he had been to the convent dozens of times before Sister Ben's death, and he wouldn't be surprised if they found hundreds of his fingerprints all over that place. There was something that I'd found that I cannot confirm, but I'm just gonna put it in here anyway because I found it in a couple places, not reputable. But apparently 8 days after his arrest, he had told officials that he had been there a lot, which we will get into the confirmed times that he had been there a lot. But once he had broken in, and this was several days before the murder had taken place, and he did so to steal necklaces or crosses. He explained that the butter knife was used as a tool to open a locked cabinet, and he even entered Sister Ben's room and had taken the cross or whatever it was that was hung above her bed, hence those specific fingerprint marks. But anyway, let's get to the official things. So the sisters and the bishops all agreed that there was no way that he had done this, and the nuns had told the bishop that Johnny would come in all the time because they knew him very well. He would visit and admire the paintings and the artifacts, their statues, and he loved to hold everything and touch the crosses. So honestly, if a mentally disabled person did come in somewhere because he wanted to take some of the cool crosses, that would not surprise me. But regardless, he was very involved in helping them as well. He had helped the sisters move their furniture in and out of the convent building onto the moving trucks, new beds coming in for older nuns like Sister Ben's, or new nuns simply moving in. He was their man to help. So this was not out of place for Johnny, and the bishop himself said, really, those fingerprints probably aren't what you think they're for. So before, when Sister Angel had said that, yeah, that is kind of incriminating, well, it's an excellent explanation for that. And on the night of Sister Ben's murder, Johnny had claimed that he was home all night playing checkers, which his mother and siblings all attested to be the truth. And as Johnny's first appearance had ended, attorney Coleus had showed back up and requested that he be appointed as Johnny's representation. And Johnny just stood there silently because he did not know his rights. He didn't know that he could have another attorney. So sure enough, Judge Don had granted this. So the court appointed the attorney that he was given, and he was trash. The law enforcement representation was trash. And Johnny's claim of innocence was basically unheard. People wanted to see him get convicted. They were out for blood. Again, a very Salem witch trial. So the blood splatter that was on the fire exit and the semen found with Sister Ben's were handed over to the medical examiner for testing. And I mentioned earlier, in 1981, DNA testing was not what it is today. But the semen samples that they were given could determine blood types. So it was really relying on the semen samples. That was the only just a freaking nightmare. Like, are you kidding me? The only thing that could have shown them anything was thrown away. Ridiculous. But anyway, when it was found that the medical examiner had failed to retain the samples, they had one job. There were allegations that one of the detectives had told him to throw it out, which probably, but nothing further came of it. And soon a second attorney to assist Johnny's defense was appointed. of the Hispanic male in the area, that the victims were of religious groups whom assisted Cuban refugees, that they were attacked in early hours of the day, and in general, that they could be related. The two murders could be related because Johnny wasn't tied to the first murder, so that would not help the case of the Sister Ben's murder if they weren't really related, right? Or if they were related. It's the wine. So, despite all of this, all of the evidence they could have used, Johnny was found guilty and sentenced to death. His execution was set for January 6 in 1991. However, he received a reprieve from the Governor Ann Richards at the request of Pope John Paul II. A literal pope is telling you, stop. But they did not listen. Apparently, this came within an hour of his execution, and Governor Richards' rare use of the ability to grant a reprieve prompted an unusual hearing by the Texas Board of Pardons to consider whether to recommend to the governor that his sentence be switched just to life. But at the hearing, the board voted 17-0 for the death sentence. So his case became a large focus of people whom opposed of the death penalty. The Catholic Diocese of Amarillo, 16 Catholic bishops, and the human rights group Amnesty International opposed of his execution. So lawyer Warren Clark actually said that Johnny was insane and suffered from multiple personality syndrome as a result of the very intense physical and sexual abuse and violence that he had faced as a child. And he had said that Johnny was simply too crazy to kill. Personally, I don't think that he would have thought to kill. But anyway, so that was important because the Supreme Court had ruled that a person who is insane and cannot comprehend an execution or the reasons behind it cannot be put to death. But prosecutors insisted that although Johnny might not be normal, he was aware of his crimes and understood the punishments. So unfortunately and devastatingly, Johnny was the 45th killer put to death in Texas since the Supreme Court allowed the resumption of capital punishment in 1976. He was executed on February 11th, 1992, and he was 28 at the time of his death by lethal injection. His last meal was ice cream, but his last words, and this is not confirmed, but widely popular, so I will mention it, as he was quoted saying, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me during all of this, but to the rest of the world, you can kiss my ever-loving ass." Now, that is the sad, sad truth of what happened to Johnny. But the story is not over. So a lawyer later took on his case as he was hired by Johnny's family years later to clear his name. He said that evidence will make it clear that Johnny was not the murderer of Sister Ben's. And this was on December of 2004, 22 years after jurors convicted him and 12 years after he was executed. The Amarillo was arrested for peeking into a window 2 weeks after that killing. But in the 1980s, evidence techniques weren't so sophisticated. But after retesting in 2004 or 2005, the retired switchboard operator Rueda had pled guilty and was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Potter County authorities filed the case after a homicide investigator resubmitted an old bedsheet for DNA testing, and the semen from the crime scene linked the parolee, who was at the time in an inpatient drug rehabilitation program. So Rueda confessed and pled guilty and now remains in jail for the Bryson's slaying. So that's interesting. Don't get me wrong, at the beginning I didn't really think it was him, but it just gets more annoying. So Quackenbush had said that during a recent interview, when he had spoke with Rueda, he described raping and beating a nun on Halloween night in 1981. Rueda, the Cuban refugee, was indicted in July after authorities had matched his DNA with the semen samples during Bryson's autopsy. But as for the comments about Sister Benz that had resurfaced and he had confessed to, Rueda's attorney, Maria Lopez, declined to comment. So 12 years after Johnny's death, the DNA match came through. And at the time of the murder, Rueda was getting assistance from a Catholic family services and living in a Catholic family home. Apparently, he actually also had a roommate, and his roommate, very close friend, was Fernando Flores, whom he claimed had apparently forced him to do it. He'd even admitted that Sister Benz gave him the white V-neck t-shirts, but still no comment from his attorney. And this was just an interview that he had done with Quackenbush that had nothing to do with the January 2005 plea of Narnie Bryson. So Narnie Bryson's family can at least have that closure, and Sister Benz is still a mystery, I suppose, up for debate. What did you guys think of today's story? Had you heard of it before? Did it drive you as crazy as it drove me? I mean, I am very dramatic, but it really drove me crazy. And what are your theories? Was Rueda lying? I don't think so. He really didn't need to at that point. If you were Charlotte, what would you have done in those moments? Leave a comment below. I always love hearing your guys' theories on everything. This story was very sad. It took place on Halloween night, so hence how it made it into my Halloween horrors. I hope that this video's audio was better than last week's. Everyone on Instagram who said to post, thank you so much for just listening to me no matter what. I think my favorite comment was someone saying that they would listen to me with like two cans and a string or something. I'll probably put in the picture here. But thank you guys for joining me. If you have not already, please like and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime ASMR videos every Wednesday between 12 and like 3. And I look forward to seeing you guys again next week, where we will definitely be having several videos. I'd say 1 or 2, but that's not true. See you guys soon. Our God is an awesome God. Who did you guys prefer?